Before we read, I'll just give you a little introduction to Daniel. We did have an introduction last time, but as Christians, we desire to live out our Christian life in holiness because we're called to please our Lord and our Savior. That's the desire we have. God is a God who is holy. We're going to talk today about the issue of seeking to avoid what we call defilement. Defilement, what is that? Defilement is a spoiling of something you wish to keep clean and pure. And spiritually speaking, we have a simple name for it, and that is that it's sin. It's the spoiling, it's the marring, it's the tarnishing of our lives in some way, either by doing something we know that God has commanded us not to do, or by avoiding or failing to do something that God requires of us. So either way, we know both actively or passively, we can indeed be those who are defiling ourselves before God. Maybe it's easier to think of an illustration, and I think I've got this picture up here of defilement, which may help. Picture a child who's been dressed up by his mother in his very best. He's been asked to be a ring bearer in a wedding, his brother's wedding. And he's wearing an uncomfortable rented suit, shiny brand new shoes, and he's been told, as you can tell a child like this, keep them clean. Okay? If you do everything you can, keep them clean. Well, the problem is that there's a playground in the yard of the church where this wedding is going to be held. And the parents are supposed to get their pictures taken in a few minutes, but there's a few minutes yet, and the child is given a little bit of freedom. And the child loves slides, you see. Christians live in a world that's filled with spiritual mud puddles. And we're attempting to avoid them. We're attempting to spiritually walk without defilement. In today's passage, Daniel and his friends are taken into an environment that you would say is riddled with spiritual mud puddles. Metaphoric, and they're forced to walk about among those puddles, and they're seeking to be clean. The potential for defilement is available at every turn. Indeed, they're forced to live and function among those puddles, and yet there's four men that we're going to read about a little bit later. All four of them come out really unscathed. They come out clean. And we are ones who want to be like that. We want to be those who are able to walk amidst the puddles, the mud puddles, and come out clean by God's grace. So let's listen to what happens in this passage of Scripture. I'll read the first 16 verses. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the house of Shinar, to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of the land of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skilled in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years. When at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. And then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat, and water to drink, and then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. And deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and their wine and they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning, skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Can you imagine, as you hear the story and what we just heard read, the potential for defilement for a Christian, for a believer in God at this time? Not merely dirtying some articles of clothing here, but not just muddying the shoes. We're talking spiritual matters, so it's a defilement of the soul. And that could be caused by the violation of one's conscience regarding obedience to God in all kinds of ways in that situation. Remember that Daniel and his friends are Jewish. They are believers. They are covenant people of God. And the Lord had made very clear how his people were to live in contrast to the rest of the unbelieving world, how they were to worship him. They were to be holy as he was holy. Now that will of God is to be found as they were trying to find out how to do that. How are they going to live that out? They found that, of course, in the law of God. What did God say in his word? And that law addressed all kinds of things. It addressed civil matters, ceremonial matters of worship, moral issues. And I said last week that they were taken from their comfortable context of Jerusalem, where the temple was, and they were transported into a new context in which now they're trying to live that faith out in that situation. The ceremonial laws became a real dilemma as they sought to worship God, because God had commanded that it was to be done in a certain way in Jerusalem at the temple. Their temple is now destroyed. They don't have access to the conveniences that they had in Jerusalem. All of the commands regarding worship of God associated with the temple, with the priesthood, with the sacrifices, with all of that have been removed. They actually are practically impossible to keep. They are far removed from where the temple is, and on top of that, the temple has been ravaged. The articles of worship have been stolen. The priesthood is scattered. It would have been hard for them to worship since they couldn't access the temple, and their freedoms to bring sacrifices to God as God had required of them is now refused. And this is actually some of the heartache that you hear when the psalmist writes Psalm 137. We know that David wrote some of the Psalms, but this is many years later. Psalm 137 was written at that time of the exile. And the psalmist from captivity is lamenting the situation that he finds himself in. The Babylonians have been mocking him. This is what he writes. This is in verse 3 of Psalm 137. Our captors require of us songs, and our tormentors require mirth, saying, sing us one of those songs of Zion. And he says, but how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How do we do that? How do we live out our Christian life in obedience to what God commands in a foreign context, in a different situation? It wasn't easy then to keep God's law in this foreign land, in a pagan context. And when we're outside of our normal context, and I said, God sometimes allows us to be put in those situations as well. We have to ask the question, how can I be as faithful as I know how to be, given the circumstances I'm in? And I'm going to say to you that since the fall, since Adam first fell into sin, the world has always been making that difficult. Right? Satan would have us not be obedient to God, and so he makes obedience very difficult. And let me give you just a little example. When I was a kid, this is a very small example. When I was just a little kid wanting to learn how to play football in America, I joined a little team with my community. And all the practices throughout the week were great, but they changed the date of the actual games to be played on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. And it was a question that I had to face as a child. Am I going to play football with my friends, or am I going to go and worship the Lord Yesterday, my son was at a Rubik's competition with Gideon and Reuben and some other friends, and actually Luke did so well that he actually qualified for the finals of the Rubik's Cube thing, which is kind of a remarkable thing. But that final, you wouldn't be surprised, was today. So Luke was not able to go and be a participant in that. But here's the thing, God's law that he gives to us is just that. It's a law. And his people who live under his lordship desire to keep the law, not as a way of sort of saying, how can I earn points with God and keep him happy with me. That's not what it is. We desire to keep the law of God because we have such a thankful heart for his gracious salvation and his provision for us in giving us and providing salvation by grace. And if they are able to do so, believers, because of the grace that's been shown to them, seek to be obedient to their Savior, their Lord. The problem that causes, though, is when believers are scattered in the context of unbelief, is that they seek to be obedient to God's law. That creates a conflict with the world. With those of the world who have beliefs and practices of a different kind. And make no mistake about it, there is a belief system in the world. Belief in and obedience, for example, to a single particular God is not well received in a pagan context. And particularly when that paganism is philosophically committed to polytheism, many gods. If you just think about what's happened in the history of Australia, during the period of colonization, and we can all look at that and really try to evaluate whether colonization is a wicked thing, did it have good elements to it, and we can have that conversation. There was certainly good, there was certainly bad, but one of the things that was good is that non-Indigenous Australia, at that point at least, became very committed to monotheism, worshiping one God, for which you and I can be very thankful. But more and more, in the last 50 years or so, it's become a nation that we live in that is increasingly returning to its old days of polytheism, pagan tendencies. Ironically, one of paganism's greatest commitments, if they were to have a dogma or some kind of statement of their faith, it would be that man is free to set his own parameters of belief without criticism. The individual must have the freedom to set his own parameters of belief. Now that's interesting because the word pagan does not mean that. If you go back to the Latin and look at what the word pagan means, it used to refer to a region of land that was fixed with boundaries around it. They used to call that the pagan region. Well, the word began to be used, however, by Christians to refer to the opposite of that, in spiritual terms. To those who have a belief system that's not clearly delineated by boundaries. No systematic theology, no spelling out of what is really to be believed. And our world is becoming more and more articulate in its commitment to every person being able to say what they believe, their commitment to spiritual things without anybody giving them any boundaries. Nobody critiquing them or getting out markers and setting out dogmas. Have you seen that in your experience? Do you see that that's what's happening in our world, is that people are being, our commitment as a society is to say that there is a freedom that all man has is to come to his own faith, or her own faith. And so it is that when believers like you and I have convictions of faith that come from a Word of God, from an unchanging standard of Scripture, that causes us to walk in a particular way because we're following what God has said in His Word, and we're trying to avoid defilement in ways that God has said are defiling, then when we wish to do certain things, like if we want to keep the Lord's Day, when we don't want to be about work during that time, and we want to keep it as a day of rest as He's commanded, or maybe when we refuse to lie about our income when we're doing our taxes, or we won't slander others, or we won't use God's name in vain, or participate in celebrations of things that God has forbidden in His Word. And all of those happen. Any number of other defilements. The world of unbelievers around us feel like Christians are challenging their worldview. They are challenging the well-accepted practices and beliefs of the worldview system around them. And they feel like we're accusing them of being defiled. Now, it may be that God's Word is making that statement, that there is some real standards, and therefore their behaviors are appropriate or not appropriate. But what happens is that the Christian becomes the target, and they reciprocate with certain things. Accusations that believers are bigoted, they're racist, they're backward, they're homophobic, they're small-minded, and you could go on and all kinds of other different with them. Our convictions often create a conflict with the world. And that's a haunting similarity between ourselves and the situation in Daniel's day. Our culture opposes convictions and ethics which are absolute, which don't have that flexibility, which actually have boundaries. Verse 2 says that Nebuchadnezzar had the young men brought to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. Now, Shinar is an interesting term to be used at that point because it's a really an antiquated name. Why is Daniel using the name Shinar instead of Babel? It wasn't even used in their day very much, Shinar. But Daniel remembers his audience, who he's speaking to. He wants to bring to mind some name, Shinar, from a previous portion of Scripture, which was in Genesis chapter 11. You may remember that. Where he wants to bring that to mind where it says this, and I quote, "And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And then they said, 'Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top reaching to the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" That was in direct defiance of God's command. And so Shinar is the city in which the Tower of Babel was built. Hear the name Babel in there. That becomes Babylon. That's where we end up in this text. So it's the city known for its opposition to God from way back. Babel becomes Babylon, and God's people are placed in that context. So this period of time is a period of, and it always has been, but I would say during this time it's not absent. This is really a time of paganism living in Babylon. There are superstitions running rampant. People are fascinated by certain things like the occult, by magicians, by myths and legends, by prayers and hymns that are given as maybe magical incantations, and scientific formula. It's interesting that in all these contexts, and you find this today too, you find good with the bad. You find them seeking science as a way of improving things. In their case, maybe for glass making. They found that they could make glass if they used a particular scientific formula. But they thought that in terms of mathematics, and Scientology, and all kinds of astrologies and so on. So when verse 4 says that these young men are brought into that culture in Shinar, and they are put there and they are taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans, think about what's happening. This is not merely like being taken from a context of you've lived and grown up in Australia, but we're going to move you now to the UK. And obviously, if you're going to live in the UK, which is another Commonwealth country, you're going to have to learn some of their history, which is unique and so on. That's going to be taught to you. It's not like that, because now you're being taken out of your context and placed in a completely different one. It's a little bit more like going to South America, or maybe to Rwanda, where now the practices of faith are not like what you're used to. Now it's complete witchcraft, and where the only doctors are witch doctors, and where the language is completely different, and you're trying to learn the language. It involves being introduced to an entirely alien worldview and everything that you've been committed to. And they are teaching you day in and day out for 3 years that you will be indoctrinated with these truths. And note here that this is what the world continues to do with its beliefs, its practices, and its systems. It teaches those as the things that are to be believed. It's a different worldview, different set of commitments, different set of beliefs. But it seeks to educate its citizens so that they will all hold firmly to those same commitments and beliefs. How did that happen in Daniel's day? Well, they took them aside and said, we're going to teach you. And it's happening every day around us in the world. It's happening in Victoria. Just take, for example, the public school system. And I'm not trying to get political here. I just want to show you that this is what happens in our world. Public school systems are often very aggressive in their teaching of secular things. One might even say pagan perspectives. Consider its teaching of evolution, just for example as a point. And this viewpoint, as you have it in the school systems today, cannot be questioned very easily. A creationist position is banned, at least it has been in many circumstances that I've seen, as an alternative position to be thought about. In this case, it's not allowed as even another thought. Consider teaching about, recently, human sexuality and identity. If you bring up an alternative perspective, that's considered sometimes as a violation of human rights and dignity. Those who attempt to speak up for God's word on certain matters are accused of certain things, hate speech, and so on. And that doesn't come only from school systems. I turn on the news, on the television, and a television program that's supposed to be presenting me news is communicating certain commitments that they have. Well, in Babylon, and this is true often with many pagan cultures, there is a consistent pattern with this, and that is that they do believe in the supernatural. There's no question about that. Indeed, they are polytheistic, so believing in multiple gods, where there are some gods that are a little bit higher than others, that have a more a ranking, if you will. There's a cornucopia of demons and minor deities, as well as a few that are thought to even be supreme deities, and so on. Well, imagine for a minute now how that kind of religious belief impacts your history, the kind of history you're learning. What does it do to the literature that's written and later read and studied? What does it do to the celebrations, the holidays that are happening in your society and your culture, your daily practices? And then, of course, how does it impact your education? These young men would receive, the stories that they were told, the way news is being reported to them, the lyrics of the songs that they listened to, and so on. And again, going back to the exchange student situation, it's one thing for you to have to go from an Australian context and maybe be moved to an American context. You might have to learn about the presidency and the Congress and all those kinds of things in government. But this is far different than it, because now you're a slave. You're a slave in a land where they speak a different language, and you are being taught, for example, something like this. You know, those crops over there in the field will not grow unless you sacrifice 2 pigeons to the god Anil. We have to do that if we want the crops to grow. That would be part of their science. That would be part of their history, their commitment. And here's the thing. I want to ask a question of parents who have children here. Parents, would you be confident if God saw fit to allow a foreign power in our day to come in and take your children away from you, that they would be able to be confident enough in their faith in God, to be able to study that kind of literature, being taught from that kind of perspective, that worldview, and still that they would remain faithful to the truth that the God of the Bible has taught us, that they would be undefiled? Have you prepared your children for that? Would you be confident that even you could stand under those circumstances if you were immersed in the culture of that kind, the kind of polytheistic instruction and indoctrination? It's kind of hard to imagine something like that. But that's actually what happened to Daniel's parents. Right? Daniel's parents had their young boy taken away from them and immersed in a foreign context. That's what happened to Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah's parents. They were thinking about their children, and their children were taken away from them and immersed in that kind of culture. Would they be faithful to the living true God? They were given an education built on false premises. Its literature was laden with pagan practices and philosophies. It regularly spoke of magic and charms and astrology as a science. And yet those young men were able to receive that kind of instruction and yet remain firm in the faith of the living God, the resolve to serve Yahweh. When we speak in verse 4 and again in verse 20 of the wisdom that these young men had, there's in Hebrew sort of an ethical and religious moral overtone to that kind of wisdom. That is to say that their knowledge is being applied in a moral, an ethical way that brings honor to God. And I don't know whether these men were very familiar with or could quote for you Proverbs, Job chapter 28:28. But Job 28:28 says, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil is understanding." Even if they weren't familiar with that text, or I imagine they weren't, nevertheless, trust and the reverence for God that caused them to have such conflict with the world. And we're going to see that all the way through the book of Daniel. It takes resolve to remain undefiled in that kind of context. And I want you to look closely at verse 8, because here's where you hear the resolve. It says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. I could preach an entirely different sermon about wisdom and just the wisdom of how he did that. He did it in a winsome way, in a gentle way. He goes to his boss and says, "Boss, I really don't want to work on the Lord's Day because I have a commitment to serving my God, to be faithful to him. May I have that permission from you?" I like how he did that. Would you allow me not to defile myself? There's pretty strict laws regarding food for the Jews, for example. Right? Undoubtedly, what the king was presenting to them, though, from one perspective, it might have been thought to be the best food you could get. You're eating the king's food. You're getting his wine. It's going to be the best. But that might have defiled them. So they have to ask, will I resolve to follow my God or not? There are going to be pressures, of course, to compromise because it's not convenient to make a fuss against, well, certainly don't want to make a fuss against King Babylon, this one who's conquering people and murdering them all over the world. Daniel undoubtedly is feeling that pressure. You don't ask this question without realizing how dangerous it is. But he's a man of resolve, that he wants to commit to serve his God, and regardless of how inconvenient that might be to him, even how threatening that might be to him. And I just want to say that one of the pressures that you face, or will face, comes from the idea that's accepted universally by those who do not know God. And that's this: that if you do follow your God, you're going to end up in a worse situation. You're going to lose your job. You're going to be fired from your work if you will work on the Lord's Day. So you'll be worse off for your obedience to God than if you were obedient to Him. If you compromise, as we're asking you to do. And this is, I want us to look at the world consumption. What is the world consumption here? And it's seen in the comment that the chief eunuch makes in verse 10. Why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? And here the assumption that the eunuch is making, I know you want to follow your God, but that's going to put you in a worse condition. It's the assumption of the world that obedience to God is God's cruel joke on you. God just likes to put rules in place. He wants to show his hand of power over you by demanding of you things that are not going to be even for your good. You're going to be in a worse condition. Think how this is played out in our day. Take obedience to the fourth commandment. Just take a random one. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What does the world assume about keeping the Sabbath day? Well, obedience to that command is going to hurt the economy. It's going to take away your freedom. It's archaic. It's simple-minded. It's old-fashioned. It's unnecessary. It wastes good, productive time that people could be doing. You could be getting a lot more work done. Society would be better if we didn't keep the Sabbath day. Really, you can do that with any of the commandments. Take the seventh commandment. Do not commit adultery. What is the world saying if you follow that commandment? Again, the same can be said of the world's assumption about obedience in this situation. You're robbing yourself of sexual freedom and pleasure. You'll be in a worse condition if you're so uptight, if you're so puritanical in your views of sexuality and so on. In truth, these assumptions can be applied to each of God's commandments. But you've got to learn, and we have to learn together, that Satan is a liar. Satan is a liar. The believer knows good and well that God is a good God. Amen. And his laws are for our abundance. It's so easy to lose track of this. Sometimes it takes resolve and courage to stand for these in the face of so much worldly assumption that it's going to be for your detriment. Upon his resolve that he believes God is good, and he does not immediately compromise to avoid somehow this awkwardness or this inconvenience. And what's more, God uses that resolve in his life to glorify himself and to reveal to the unbelievers the falsity of that assumption. Part of standing firm, seeking to remain undefiled, is also the opportunity to be a light to those who are trapped in darkness. When you stand for a conviction, you're saying, God's ways are what is best. God's ways are for our good. The joy, the peace, the abundance to be had in following Christ has to be communicated to our world that has believed the lie. They are better off without God. They are better off if they compromise. They're being told a lie and are living a subpar, counterfeit life. Jesus said, I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. So Daniel issues an interesting thing. He issues a call to inquire to this eunuch, this one in authority over him. Again, kind of gutsy if you want my opinion. This one who has the right to do with him what he wills. He asks the guy to inquire, and he basically says, I'm going to challenge your assumptions of belief for a moment. Now, here's the thing. Christians today are so used to the opposite. Who challenges who in this world? Well, what happens is that the world challenges the Christian in his belief system. Unbelief regularly challenges our convictions of faith. But I suggest to you that God's Word calls believers to turn that around. Like you and me, to turn and challenge the assumptions of unbelief, to issue a call to inquire, to think, to analyze what God has said, and to be looking to see if He's telling the truth. Verse 12 is a challenge. Daniel invites this eunuch in charge to test his assumptions. It's really no less than an invitation to see if God's way, this way of obedience to God, yields a better result than the world's way. Now that's bold, isn't it? That's courageous. But it's driven by a belief that God is good. His way is best. It's driven by faith. It's driven by conviction. So I have to ask you, do you believe that God's way is better? Keeping the commandments, does that benefit mankind? Are you willing to challenge the unbelief of the world by inviting them to at least inquire and to test God out in those matters? It's really the part of the soldiers of the Lord moving from a defensive posture by which we cower in the face of the world. We have our shields up and we hope that they don't ask us any more questions. We hope that they don't attack us any longer. We hope they don't damage us too badly. To a new idea, a new thought. That we take the offense in the situation here, seeking to confront and challenge the world and its folly and its lostness. You know that if the church will advance and see the kingdom of God come and His will done on earth as it is in heaven, then Christians have to change their posture from that defensive, scared to death, kind of cowering in the corner kind of thing, and saying, you know what? We serve the living King of the kings who sits on the throne of heaven. Amen. And I want to ask you, friend, who sits in unbelief at this point, will you be willing to test God and see what His Word says? Now, in order to do that, of course, we all need what Daniel received, and that's God's favor. We have to have God's favor. Any advancement of the kingdom of God in His fallen world has to have God's favor to be successful. Because God promises to grant it to those who demonstrate faith. Think about how often you've actually heard that testimony coming from people who are kind of on the front lines. Often we ask missionaries to come and speak before our congregation. Inevitably, they will say, when I have been obedient to God, He has shown favor, and He has blessed. Verse 9 articulates God's favor on those who trust and obey Him. So did Psalm 37, so does the rest of Scripture. But this is what it says in verse 9. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. I would like to have those two things. Would you not? Favor and compassion. As we stand up and we resolve to challenge the unbelief of our world, and we do it in a kind, we do it in a winsome, we do it in a generous way with the world, not saying, as so often can happen, Christians think they're kind of full of themselves and say, well, I've got the truth, you're blind spiritually, so let me just, you should challenge the faith. No, not at all. It's but for the grace of God, I would be in your shoes, but God has shown me favor, and I want you to know that favor. Would you be willing to test that, you see? God, give us your favor and make our testimony bear fruit. That's what we seek. Oh, that God might do that with us, with you and me. Do you not yearn for that? Honestly, don't you yearn for that? Then we have to ask for it. We have to ask Him. And then be willing to act on our convictions, as Daniel did, even under the pressure of unbelief in a godless land. And then finally, I want us to see one more thing, and that is the assurance that the truth will be verified. God will be glorified. God's favor showed itself in that the chief eunuch here risked it all, even his job, his life before the king. He had inquired of God. And he allowed the test to be done, and the truth is verified. God was glorified. God's truth will always be verified. Always. Indeed, all of the history ultimately brings glory to God because he's seen to be the truth. Remember how we spoke of the articles of the temple being taken to Babylon and what was being said by that? By the king of Babylon, it's basically, my gods are stronger than Jehovah. You see what I did? I took all his stuff and I put it in my temple. Friends, where is that temple today? And where is the church? Where is the kingdom of God? Where is his? It's still here. It's still functioning. This is what God does. History reveals a different conclusion, that the Babylonian gods are somehow in power. In the historic record, as Daniel progresses, these same articles are taken back to Jerusalem. The return. And will be returned to the temple as vindication of the truth of God's sovereignty. God may bring hardship upon his people for a time, no doubt. And it may seem that evil is winning. But he's never overpowered. God is never overpowered by some stronger force. There's no other God, no other power who has forced God's hand into anything. He's never out of control. The message of the book is again a message of his sovereignty. So friends, you and I will face opposition from the world if we stand up. If we try to live for Christ in the public arena. And you will be confronted by the world's assumptions, their commitments, their practices. You will. But if you resolve to avoid defilement and to walk in obedience to your God, you call the world to inquire and test this living God in their assumptions. The truth of God's word, you will experience God's favor. And in doing so, you will bring glory to God. And friends, that's your chief end. Your chief end is to bring glory to God and then to enjoy Him in it. Well, that's the repeated message of the book of Daniel. And it's up to you and me to first believe it and then imitate it in this faith. May God enable us to do that to His glory.